Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Rajesh Merchandani, the Vice President of Communications and Policy Outreach here at the Centre. Very nice to see so many of you here this morning. If I can ask you to silence your phones as the programme gets underway. Now, we live in pretty testing times. If you look at the papers today, I'm sure you'll agree when you look at the US budget numbers. Now, CGD is a non-partisan organisation, but we are unashamedly globalist. We believe, as I'm sure pretty much everyone in this room does actually, that international cooperation is the way to address some of the world's biggest problems. So it's great that we have two people on the stage today who bring so much experience of working in the international sector. Helen Clark, we welcome, very happy to welcome you back to the Centre. Helen is, of course, the Administrator of the UNDP, the UN's largest agency. She's been in the position for 8 years, and in fact, next month will step down. Under her tenure, just to give you a few highlights, obviously the UNDP commemorated its 50th anniversary last year. It also created a strategic plan which streamlined its operations and thought about prioritizing its resources more effectively, something I'm sure we'll be talking about today. And it met its target 2 years early to have 50% of its staff female, which is great news. I'm also delighted that our new president, Masood Ahmed, will be making his CGD event debut with you today. No pressure. Masood joined us a couple of months ago from the IMF, where he headed up the fund's operations in the Middle East and North Africa, 32 countries. Prior to that, he held significant positions of authority at major international organizations, including DFID and the World Bank. So you see what I mean about a lot of international experience. Oh, of course, you know Helen as the former Prime Minister of New Zealand as well. Sorry, just missed that slight detail. So we're going to invite them to the stage in a second for a conversation. We want to engage you as well, so there'll be time for questions. There'll also be time to hopefully get some questions from our audiences who are watching virtually. Good morning to you on our live stream, on our YouTube channel, and following us on Twitter as well. If you are watching from a different location, then there are ways that you can contribute to the conversation as well. You can send us a question, either tweet it to us at CGDev is the handle, use the hashtag CGD Talks, and actually anybody here who'd like to tweet, we'd very much encourage that. CGD Talks is the hashtag. It's, well, that's the handle on the screen anyway. Also, if you're watching on the live stream, there's a comment section at the bottom of the page. You can leave a question there. And if you're watching on our YouTube channel, you can leave a question in the comment section there as well. Please do contribute. I'd love to get some more contributions from people around the world who are watching as well as in the room. So with that and without further ado, I'm going to invite our speakers to the stage to take it away. Helen Clark, Masood Ahmed, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Rajesh, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming. Let me add my own warm welcome to CGD for all of you, including those who are joining us virtually. And I'm really happy that the first event that I've had the opportunity to do here at CGD in my new role is to welcome Helen Clark to CGD. And Rajesh just given you a little bit of history on Helen's extraordinary career that she's had, professional career, both in New Zealand and in the UN system. And I want to focus a little bit really in the conversation we're going to have on the UN system, on it, what it's achieved, on where it's going, and perhaps the best way to get started. And is really to just say, you know, you're now sort of coming to the end of 8 years at UNDP and also as chair of UNDG. And for me, that's really important because part of it is really the move towards one UN. Looking back during these 8 years, what do you see as having been the big achievements that have happened under your leadership at the UN system? And also, what's the unfinished agenda? Where do you think that things that you wished should have happened, could have happened, haven't yet been able to get off?
Well, Good morning, everybody. And I'll probably take the question on two levels. Firstly, what's happened at UNDP, but secondly, what's happened more broadly with the UN role in development. So at UNDP, we're in the business of continually reinventing ourselves, as you must. Times are very volatile, funding sources change, you have to have new modalities, have to stay responsive and proactive at the same time as there's so many emergencies blindsiding you, and you have to upend programs to be relevant to developmental needs in the midst of crisis. So there's been a lot of reinvention, a lot of adaptation, a lot of new model development, better strategic planning for sure, quite a lot of internal organisational change to align with strategic plan, value for money, of course, something we all have to be very conscious of. We did locate a lot of people out of the New York headquarters out to regional hubs. We did drop the number of managers relative to staff, tried to take duplication out of the organisation. So, always conscious of trying to get more for programming and less on administration, and we got to shift on that. And I think, I leave seeing, UNDP positioned as an organisation that's well respected in countries it works in and is a partner of choice for so many of the development partners. It's no small asset that it's had 11 years of clean audit reports. You can't take those things for granted. They take a lot of work. I was last in this room in April last year for the event with IATI and Publish What You Fund, because we did well again on the transparency ranking. Very, very proud of that. We really turned ourselves inside out from being a typical old UN organisation that never told anybody anything to saying, it's all on the internet, come and get it. Here's the open portal, how can we help you get the information you want? So there's been a lot of big cultural change like that. And that has to keep happening. I mean, there's no end point to this. I have a philosophy, you have to have continual improvement, adaptation, change to stay relevant and responsive. Now, for the UN itself, I came 9 years into the Millennium Development Goals. And little did I think when I came to the General Assembly High-Level Week in September 2000, and the New Zealand diplomats said to me, oh, by the way, sign this Millennium Declaration. It's all been agreed, they said. Oh, yeah, okay. New Zealand signed on, and then you go home and you don't really think about that much again. Then you come to UNDP and everybody has high expectations of the Millennium Development Goals, which took, I think, quite a bit of time to catch on, because the way they were developed was a New York headquarters thing. The diplomats negotiated the Millennium Declaration that had the areas of the goals. They were eventually promulgated. And it took a while for that to get traction. And when I came to New York, I remember saying to UNDP, well, what are we actually doing to support people to achieve the goals? And they said, oh, there's been a lot of mainstreaming and it's getting into plans. And I said, yeah, but what are we doing? Because we seem to be short on quite a lot of targets 9 years in. And that led to some quite exciting work about, what would it take to achieve the Millennium Development Goals, and then developing that into an acceleration tool to support countries to really, step up progress on goals that were a bit woeful. And out of that came a lot of thinking about the cross-sectoral things that you needed to do to make progress on any goal, actually, which was very useful now for the new development agenda which has emerged, which is designed as a cross-silo, cross-sector, whole-of-government kind of approach. So I think, the UN has been good at agenda setting with the MDGs. The last couple of years have been very, very big agenda setting years. 2015, I say, was the biggest since Ben-Hur, because we went from the new disaster risk reduction framework to the Addis Ababa Financing for Development framework, which is a distinct improvement on those of the past. Much more realistic, I think, about what the role of ODA is and what the role of other actors are. We talk about that. Through to the September summit for the SDGs, and then, of course, the Paris Climate Agreement, which was long delayed from what should have happened in 2009. And then last year there was the World Humanitarian Summit with agendas out of that, the Habitat Conference in Quito with the new urban agenda, so it goes on. So great at setting agendas, but agendas mean nothing if countries don't embrace them, incorporate them into their plans, strategies, budgets, policies. And so if you ask what's the unfinished business now, well, it's implementation. And for UNDP, set up in 1966 with U Thant saying UNDP is to lead the global fight against poverty for the UN, we are the connector agency. We're the only agency really in the system, the UN entity system, which doesn't have a very specific sectoral brief. You know, among my colleagues, there are those whose brief is women, children, health, labour. That's not UNDP. UNDP connects things. It's looking for what are the combination of things that need to be done to make development hum. So there's a special role for UNDP in leading on that. So, well, we could go on to discuss the times that we're in, but actually the MDGs got launched in a very different geopolitical and economic climate from the SDGs. We live in very challenging times. Achieving the SDGs will require a great deal of finance, and there's not a lot of public finance around, so many challenges.
Yeah, I want to come to the question of SDGs and financing going forward, but maybe just still staying for a few minutes on the UNDP. So you mentioned one thing, which was sort of UNDP role as the connector, and I remember going back now 20 years when the UNDG was created, the development group, and that was essentially a response to the concern, both within the UN system and outside the UN system, that all the different UN agencies kind of operating in parallel and weren't talking enough to each other. And the whole point was to try and bring them together, and there's the one UN model. And I also remember that first few years, this was a little bit of a struggle. Because each of the agencies came with their own mandates, their own governance, their own funding to some extent, their own boards, their own culture, their own way of operating, and getting them all to sort of work as a group has been progress being made, but it's probably still not where you want it to be. So I wanted to get your sense, in the role you've played as the UN Development Group chair. How far along are we now in terms of the degree to which the UN system in development is operating in a coherent, integrated way? And I want to go one step further and sort of ask you, how far do you think it needs to operate? Because we sort of assume that, the ultimate integration of everybody working together is probably the right outcome. Is it, in your view, after the experience you've had, how close are we to where we should be?
Well, it works as a federation of entities with many different governance structures. If you set out to design it, you would not design it like this. But it contains many organisations, each set up with separate mandates, separate governance structures. And every 4 years, the General Assembly passes a resolution on the operational activities for development. But actually, the General Assembly resolutions have no power whatsoever over any specialised agency. And of course, there are a lot of specialised and very powerful agencies. So it's not the sort of system where you can have an Überführer who kind of decrees this is the way it's going to go. You have to bring everybody along. So a lot of my time over the years has been, working with key leaders in the system, and we've had wonderful people at this sort of Assistant Secretary General level who are the workhorses of the UNDG to get the joined up procedures for how we operate better together at the country level, for getting a joined up approach to the Sustainable Development Goals implementation, for endeavouring to tackle more common business operations strategies. And all of this can go further and deeper. But if you ask me, is it likely you'll get fundamental reform in one agency? No. tell it to the ILO, tell it to the WHO, tell it to the FAO. I mean, there's just years of tradition behind these things. But you can, through persuasion, goodwill, charm, hard work, focal points, bring people along to make a meaningful contribution together.
So maybe now we come to the other point that you raised, which is that when the MDGs were agreed, the world was in quite a different place. And now the consensus around development, not just in the US, and we'll get a bit to the US in a moment, but more broadly, isn't what it was 15 years ago. So you've been sitting sort of in the middle of this, and you've been watching this process, participating in it, leading bits of it. In your mind, what is it that, how would you explain or how would you articulate what has brought about this fraying of the consensus on development, and what can we do to try and rebuild that consensus?
Well, I think going back to 2000 was a time of hope, right? People said a new millennium. Could we do better in the 21st century than the woeful 20th century we'd just been through? So it was a time of hope. And then along came the global financial crisis, which became an economic and social crisis of huge dimensions. And the money which had been there for development in many countries was the obvious first place to cut when developed countries' budgets were under pressure. And I think another way in which we felt the impact of that in the UN system was that through those earlier years of the century, there'd been the conferences around development effectiveness and Paris and Accra, and it was agreed that funding should be strategic. And then come to much tighter times, and donors want their flags on things, and they find it harder to tell the story about what their money went to in the core budget of agencies. So core budgets start to come down, and tagged funding goes up, and yet you still must be strategic and work within your mandate. So all of that's been quite challenging. So I think, firstly, global financial crisis definitely had an impact, and that to me means that when you're making the arguments for development, you can't just make the argument that it's a good thing to do, that it's solidarity, that those who have more should help those who have less, because that doesn't cut a lot of ice in many audiences. So you have to go to other arguments like the incredible benefits for all of us if we're living in a more peaceful and prosperous world. And if you're looking at the demographics of most of the advanced economies, they're not growing populations. Some are actually in decline. So where are the markets of the future? The markets of the future are in the global south. But the global south needs to be prosperous for that to be supportive of ongoing development in developed countries as well. So I think you look for arguments like those, that it's in our mutual interest that globally living standards are on the rise, that health systems can cope with controlling and averting disease outbreaks, that more prosperous and socially cohesive and well-governed societies are less likely to spill over into outright conflict and cause problems which have ripple effects literally thousands of miles away from the source of the problem. I think that there's all those kinds of arguments that can be made for continuing to invest. So, global financial crisis, having to put the argument in much more hard-headed terms, and then you come to the events of the last 6 years, particularly with the Syria crisis, and the impact of that on development has been to skew a lot of funding over to humanitarian relief. And this is understandable because people's lives are on the line. There's this huge scale of the forced displacement crisis. In development, we have particularly from about 2 to 3 years into the crisis, been able to be heard on the importance of going beyond relief to actually supporting people to have the resilience to cope in these desperate circumstances. And that's seen us busy on livelihoods and basic services in Syria, livelihood services, social cohesion, working municipalities in neighbouring countries. But it has definitely skewed development funding, the scale of protracted conflicts and emergencies that we're seeing at the present time. So you'll have growing business in those areas, but struggle to get the core resource which you could program out to the stable and poor.
Yes, I think that's a good way to put it. And I do wonder sometimes whether we in the development community have done enough to continue to explain what the benefits of development have been in the last decade. If I look back for the last decade, I find it hard to see where we have made the compelling case. So a lot of the discussion has been around the link between development and security. And I think that's clearly what is the most urgent, the most politically, that has the most traction, because that's where you can see the link. Sometimes we make links between development and security where the evidence is a little weak, but we do make those links. But I think beyond that, a lot of the discussion has shifted into sort of a discussion about value for money, which is really important. But the positive narrative about what development beyond dealing with the fragile states, and I think as you've said, more and more of our work is in fragile states and conflict, what the benefits of that are for a global community in the medium term is something that perhaps we need to do a little bit more on going forward, and that's something that we should certainly think about. Now, maybe come a little bit to the current conjuncture now. As you said, we're a somewhat more difficult time. Rajesh mentioned as we started that today, here in the US, we've got a set of budget proposals out which envisage substantial cuts in the foreign assistance, but also in funding for the UN system. We don't know exactly what the final outcome will be, and there's not much point in speculating about that. But clearly, there's going to be some significant consequence of this coming down. And I wanted to get a little bit of a sense from you, Helen, on if there were substantial cuts for the UN system from the US, what would that mean? How big a problem is it for the UN system to deliver on the aspirations of the people that you are serving? And also, what are the things that you think that are done by UNDP and by the other UN system development agencies that are better done multilaterally than bilaterally? And I say that to you because earlier this week on Monday, I don't know, some of you may have been here or seen online, we had a session about what are the consequences of cutback in US development assistance. We had a range of views of panelists sitting here. And there was one set of views which basically took the line that there's virtually nothing that is being done multilaterally in some by the UN system that couldn't be done just as well bilaterally. And I think it is important to have this opportunity today for you to set out a little bit, in a way, your stall as to why there are certain things that are better done by the UN system than they are bilaterally.
Well, I'd go further. I'd say there are things that can only be done by the UN system. And that's particularly in this sort of governance area that UNDP has a mandate in. Look, there's any number of countries in our world with rather authoritarian governments who the only person who will get in the door to work on opening up some space on human rights, civil society, development of the parliament will be UNDP. Because it comes with the brand and the legitimacy of the United Nations. So I think we bring a value because we are universally present and able to work across all political systems to the value and charter and conventions and principles of the UN, but having entry points which frankly are not available to a lot of bilateral donors. There's any number of countries I could think of where if a Western country turns up and says, we're here to improve your governance, they'll say, oh, that's nice, but you won't get any further. I think the added value, and we obviously think a lot about this, not just in UNDP, but also in the UN development system, comes from the legitimacy of being associated with a universal membership organisation, the long-term relationship with governments, which gives the entry points. And I mean, UNDP celebrated its 50th anniversary last year, but it's been around in some form well before that. Others also are of long standing. And then, we generally have the respect of the countries that we work in. So we're able to do things that others can't. And also, we have a reputation for staying even when the going's tough. Any number of countries we see where pandemonium erupts, a lot of the donors just can't be there anymore. But one way or another, we're there. Even in the worst days of a civil war, we'll be there. We'll have the connections built over a very, very long time with actors throughout the country. So for those who want to deliver, regardless of context, UNDP is there. And I might say an indispensable partner in that respect to organisations like the Global Fund, which are very, very important, but don't have a physical presence in countries. And where they do have confidence in the fiduciary standards and capacity of governments, of course they will fund directly. But that isn't universally the case. So who do they come to then to get the vital services delivered for HIV, malaria, TB? They come to UNDP, which has the fiduciary standards, the transparency, the accountability. So there's a lot of reasons like that which give us an advantage. Now, as for what the implications of cuts to international assistance from here would be, impossible to say really till we see the shape of it, see how it's allocated. I think it's clear what won't be funded, like UN Population Fund and UNESCO and maybe some other obvious examples. I think there's also the issue of to what extent will other funders step in. You've already seen from the Dutch government, for example, supported by some others, an initiative on the funding for family planning and reproductive health services. In the past, when UN Population Fund has lost funding from the US, other donors have stepped in. Whether they're in a position to do that fully this time, I wouldn't know. I think, however, it may well also create opportunities for some of the major emerging economies to make their mark more. China announces quite substantial sums of money for assistance these days. Turkey's been a very fast-growing contributor. Korea, a number of examples. So we may well see, not obviously whole gaps filled, nothing like it, but others starting to see, well, we could have a bigger role to play here for geopolitical and other reasons. My impression is that one area that will be looked at in terms of value for money is peacekeeping. And I don't think the UN should shy away from taking this very seriously, because some missions stay a long time and they're rather large. So it may be that if funding's in question, it's a time to look at, well, is it really important still to be there and at that scale? I think it's not a bad thing to be asking those kinds of questions.
Mm-hmm. So as you said, I mean, UNDP funding has evolved over the past decade. If you compare the sources of funding today with what they were a decade ago, you've got a broader range of donors. You've got more money coming in from the countries in which you operate as partnership, their contribution directly to the programs in those countries. I wanted to get a sense from you of how has that changed your profile? Have you, as a result of, for example, now if you get more money from the countries where you're operating, and therefore obviously they have a greater role in defining priorities, and you've identified two areas where you say that the UNDP can play a role that others can't, which is sort of governance and being on the ground and in difficult situations. How do you match where you see your value added is greatest with what the diverse sources of funding want you to do? Because if I look at where the money is spent, sort of 2/3 of the money out of the UNDP is really spent on broad-based responsive institutions, promoting inclusive growth. And that's a very broad agenda. And if you look at what's being spent actually on let's say, governance, it's about 10 to 15% or so. Now, these categories are always a little bit, blurred. So you can be doing things under one category that actually affect many. But I wanted to get a sense from you of how easy is it for the UNDP to actually say, this is what we do best, and this is what we're really going to focus on, given the nature of how you're being increasingly funded?
Well, firstly, because of the role of UNDP in the system as the agency which is doing the coordinating and leadership role, it's very important that it stays strong financially. So whatever the funding flows relevant to mandate, UNDP will aim to be in a good position to access them. Because the UN system relies on UNDP being there to carry that representation function. And in many middle-income countries, we wouldn't have the doors open today if it wasn't for the very substantial support of the Global Environment Facility, and now increasingly the Green Climate Fund. But that gives the basic viability of the office on which you can then build the other presence and, if possible, do some of the governance and other work as well. In terms of adapting to the funding environment, I mean, the core funding is down, as it is for many, but there is funding out there. It's sad to say that you'll see the funding for the Syria country office soar, or Jordan, or Lebanon, or Yemen, or South Sudan, all because you're bringing a development response to emergencies. The vertical funds are very important, not only the GEF and the Green Climate Fund, but also the Global Fund puts a lot of money, and we're talking hundreds of millions through UNDP every year. Also, the relationship with the development banks. There's a lot of, as you would know from your background, IFIs, a lot of underperforming and non-performing loans out there. And relationships with a strong implementation agency can change that. So we're starting to pick up more of that kind of work, including work in countries in profound crisis like Yemen, where there's been quite a big breakthrough with the World Bank putting a couple of $100 million through UNDP and quite a significant sum through UNICEF and through the WHO as well. Because we're there, we can deliver on the ground. Now, you're right that developing countries themselves increasingly paying for the work that we do, particularly the middle-income countries, because if they value the presence, then it's in their interest to find a way to make it financially possible. And we have quite a lot of money put through us for a wide range of reasons in countries from the sort of solidly middle income through to least developed countries. Argentina will put about $250 million a year through UNDP. Senegal will put $200 million through to get things done. And of course, one must build capacity as one does it, because you're not in the business of always doing things for people, but we can accelerate implementation. So, one way or another, we're agile. We've adapted ourselves to be able, within the mandate that we have, because our strategic plan tells us where we should be working, then to look at what are the conceivable sources of finance and be able to be flexible enough to access them.
Great. Well, I want to make sure that people in the room have an opportunity to raise questions that they would. So I think Rajesh has currently agreed to moderate now and call on you to ask Helen any questions that you would have. And of course, you want me to chip in, I'm happy to chip in too.
Sure, great. So 2 speakers for the price of 1 today, everybody. So ask them both questions. What kind of a bargain that is. We've got some microphones going round. I'll probably take 2 or 3 questions at a time. If I call on you, please stand up, say your name, your affiliation, and then I invite you to make a concise question as opposed to a long or even short statement, in fact. We've got a couple of questions that have come in virtually as well, so we'll get to those in a second. So let's start. This gentleman at the front, lady on the side there, and then we'll take the lady on the back row there, and then afterwards we'll come to you, sir.
My name is Larry Bridwell, and I teach international business at Pace University in New York. And one of the big topics is financial inclusion, which the Center for Global Development has done wonderful work on. But I'd be curious as to your opinion of what has happened in India under Prime Minister Modi, because I'm trying to get a sense whether this was a good thing or a bad thing. But he obviously got a mandate in the recent election. And I want this in the context of bottoms-up development as opposed to just what the institutions are doing. And Bill Gates believes that this is the best 15 years because of the impact of digital technology and with the mobile banking. So I think all this stuff comes into play in India.
Okay. Now, you're talking about demonetization, are you?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Specifically, thank you.
And then lady on the side there.
Yes, my name is Jerry Hush, and I want to thank you. I was actually the UNDP accountability specialist just prior to your coming in. And I'm asking actually a much broader question. One of the key issues that we discovered was that you're really dealing with a complex system. And a lot of the day-to-day work is actually quite flat. It's not dealing with complexity. And in trying to deal with accountability, we were discovering the culture issue. How do you envision working in this complex federation unless we actually change the way we think about those relationships between all of those actors?
Okay, and then we'll get one more question, the lady on the back row there.
Hi, my name is Catherine Kelly. I work at the American Bar Association's Rule of Law Initiative. And I wanted to ask a question about the UN Plan of Action to Prevent Violent Extremism. How has that evolved, and what has the role of UNDP been in sort of the implementation of the recommendations that the plan has made? And with these budgetary issues, what are you predicting in the future in terms of following through on that?
Okay, let's get some responses. Now, some of those questions, may speak to your expertise, some may not. I can invite that person to silence their phone. Thank you. So if some of the questions don't necessarily match your expertise, although I'm sure you have expertise in many areas, then I'm sure you'll take that into account. But let's, I think we should probably start with the middle question from the lady who formerly at the UNDP about the complex systems, the federal system of the UNDP, and this kind of culture between the different agencies. How do you kind of navigate that relationship between actors in order to become more accountable? Because UNDP obviously one of the most transparent agencies, the most transparent agency.
Well, a lot of work has gone into systems, standard operating procedures where, all the agencies buy into this is the way that we're going to work at the country level, and everybody has. Then you have to implement. One of the issues has been what's the accountability of a head of agency in a country to the country team and the resident coordinator when they have their vertical accountability to their own agency headquarters. So in essence, you have to try and matrix that because, of course, their own agency is the one that is mobilising funding for them and has the mandate and strategic plan. But then at the local level, you have to work within the agreement with the government, the UN Development or Partnership Assistance Framework, and be accountable for results there. So it's kind of dual lines of accountability, and always will be, as long as you have a range of agencies and not one mega agency, which I don't think can be achieved. I'm going to defer to my colleague with years of experience in the IFIs on the demonetisation issue, but let me just say on digital technology, UNDP has been housing a secretariat for the Better Than Cash initiative, which Raj Shah was very keen on when he was at USAID. And it is a public-private partnership. Some of the big credit card agencies, for example, are involved in it. And Queen Maxima of the Netherlands is a SG special advocate for financial inclusion and really promoting digital ways of being able to bank and transfer money. So we have been quite proactive on that, working also with the small UN Capital Development Program, which is a part of UNDP. And we look for opportunities to really push better than cash, because we see that if you can get digital payment to real people, then you cut out the middleman, you cut out the opportunity for corruption and siphoning off money and so on. We've been able to put digital technology for transferring money to good effect in some of the big emergencies, as have WFP and others. You know, the load up the WFP credit card for the refugee camp for people to buy their supplies in the shop. For UNDP, we undertook the payment of all the health and allied workers through the Ebola crisis, because people just weren't getting paid with the collapse of public administration. So we took that on, and virtually everybody got paid, which was rather important to the response. The response to Typhoon Haiyan, as I recall, the cash for work workers who were employed to remove debris and other things were digitally paid. So we do put a lot of emphasis on this. On the issue of violent extremism, UNDP has been working hard on this, and we feel that our take on it is, what are the root causes and what could we as development actors contribute? So there's been some quite interesting work done from within our Africa Bureau and at the country level, including going and talking to some of the young people who are detained because they've been with Boko Haram or whatever, and trying to get to the root of what is the motivation. Actually, usually it's not ideology, it's a bit of excitement. When you haven't got a livelihood, life isn't offering much. I remember going to one very poor country, which is experiencing a lot of extremism, and the head of OCHA said to me, you've got to realise there's not many positive opportunities for young people around here, but there's a lot of negative ones, and they pay. And when you look at the sums of money that terrorists were paying or traffickers were paying, even if you did have a job tilling the fields, it wasn't going to compete with that. So, on root causes, we're very much into looking at what could be done to create economies that provide development fit for youth, engage youth, not just in the economy, but also in the society and with their voice. A lot of societies aren't very good at listening to young people, and yet when you have a powerful youth demographic coming through, you don't listen to and don't engage that demographic at your peril. So that's kind of the zone we're operating in, and we think it's very legitimate for us as development actors to be saying, well, here's clearly a significant problem. How could we contribute by going back and addressing root causes?
Masood, let's get a comment from you on the demonetisation in India.
Yes, I will. And if I may just add one footnote to the final question on cause of extremism that you were referring to, Helen. I think it's quite extraordinary when you look out 30 years from where we are, 35 years, 70% of the young people in the world are going to be in Africa. And so investing in making sure that they have the skill set and the motivation and the opportunities to be able to have a meaningful project for life is going to be one of the existential questions in terms of how the world will look at that time. And yet, I do worry that a lot of our thinking about how to deal with violent extremism, but also about how to deal with migration, is very much a short-term focus. You know, it's not thinking in terms of the medium-term opportunities that will need to be created to be able to deal with the demographic transitions that are going to underpin a lot of economic people flows, capital flows, trade flows in 20 or 30 years' time. So I just wanted to add that small footnote. Now, I think coming to the questions you were saying about demonetization, a lot of people have tried to look at what the impact will be, and I think the economic survey that has just come out of the Indian government itself has estimated that there's going to be a short-term negative impact in terms of the economy because it was so dependent on cash and because the implementation of the demonetization program was done in a way that created more bottlenecks than you might have both expected or wanted in any program of that nature. Now, the other side of this, however, is the point that you're making about moving towards digital electronic payment. And I have to say, I think I'm really excited about the opportunities that lie ahead over the next decade in terms of the gains in the developing world and the development business from accelerating the adoption of new technology, not just in terms of payment systems. I mean, we in CGD have done some very interesting work on making cash the default form of providing support during humanitarian crises to refugees. So rather than providing them with goods and services, give them the cash and allow them to go out and buy it. That's still not the case in most humanitarian relief programs today, where many agencies prefer to manage the delivery of goods, products, and in most cases, we think you can actually get better results by providing people cash that they can use. Electronic payments get around many of the problems that were associated with cash delivery. Beyond the use of digital payments, I think the use of technology, blockchain, now using biometrics in terms of identification, are, I think, going to open up huge opportunities for improving savings. Now, another part of Indian discussion in India today is whether the possibilities offered by technology, in particularly the combination of digital payment and biometrics, makes it better to reach the poor through a universal income rather than through targeted assistance program. That conversation would not have been possible if we had not had the opportunities that the technological revolution has opened up. And we're going to have, I think, Rajesh will correct me if I'm wrong, but we're planning to have a session in about a month's time here on exactly the experience or the prospects and challenges for using universal basic income in a situation like India to see whether in fact that's feasible, it's going to be better than targeted programs or not. So I think there's a whole bunch of issues that you've raised which are all very exciting.
Yeah, so probably in the week of the spring meetings, we're hoping to have a conversation about that, as Masood pointed out. Let's get a couple more questions from the floor, and then we'll go to the live stream. This gentleman in the red shirt here, you have your hand up. Lady on the side over there, and then the gentleman there, you had your hand up from the beginning. Okay, then we'll take some more in a second.
I'd like to explore the implications of the economic nationalism. A lot of countries have grown because of exports, and the United States was willing to import. Those days are gone, and other countries are going to follow that example. It is arithmetically impossible for all the countries in the world to run a trade surplus. If nobody is willing to import, how can other countries grow by exports? Is it possible for them all to grow simply by their domestic markets? If not, what options are left?
Thank you. Lady over there.
Hi, my name is Priyali. I'm a student of public policy at SAIS Johns Hopkins. While gender equality is a key SDG goal, it's also important in terms of the other goals too, and they're looking at gender mainstreaming. But a funding cut, would that anywhere impact critical, but also not immediate primary goals like gender mainstreaming in other SDGs?
Okay, and then the gentleman there.
Hi, Doug Brooks with the International Stability Operations Association, the private sector companies that work in conflict, post-conflict, and disaster relief. In terms of countries that have actually developed under conflict conditions, Colombia, Sri Lanka, Angola perhaps, and a few others, I wonder if there's a model country that you kind of look to see how you do development in times of conflict, because that seems to be something we may have to deal with in the future.
Okay, good questions there. Speakers, I saw that there were lots of other hands going up, so I'm going to invite you to provide concise remarks and get through more questions. Helen, let's start with you. Let's take them from the top, actually, the implications of economic nationalism. And Masood, I think you'd have some really interesting points to make on this as well. Can all countries grow if everyone stops importing?
Well, I somehow don't think world trade's about to end, you know. Coming from a small export-oriented economy, in the food business, I think there's always going to be business for New Zealand. And I mean, New Zealand went through quite a radical structural adjustment going back to the 1980s, which saw a good deal of the manufacturing which had grown up under the shelter of protection go. It relocated elsewhere. Now, would it ever come back? No, because New Zealanders won't work for the wages for which the goods are being produced elsewhere. And I think you could probably tell that story many times over. So I'd be very surprised if in the end we won't keep trading and buying and selling. I think an interesting point on gender equality. One of the issues I think with the SDGs is there are so many of them and so many targets. It is easy to pick and choose, and easy to say infrastructure is a big priority, energy is a big priority. Of course, they're big priorities, but human development's a big priority too. And you cannot reach all the aspirations of the current global agenda of leaving no one behind if you're not going to really have a good go at gender equality. So, making the arguments for keeping that as something incredibly important to fund throughout the spectrum of development is extremely important. On the last question, I was really struggling to think of any country that really had done well developing in times of conflict, because the truth is it's hard. I mean, how many years of human development has Syria lost? I don't want to put words in the mouth of the World Bank, but aren't we told that for a country that's been through a profound crisis, it can take up to 30 years to get back to the GDP per capita that you had before you went into that dive? So it's tough, even for the countries that aren't the generator of the conflict, but are on having the spillover effects, like Lebanon and Jordan. It's very, very hard to keep growing and developing when a profound crisis next door to you overwhelms you. So I think the message I take from that is we have to do a great deal more to avert conflict, because once it begins and goes into the downward spiral, it causes a lot of human suffering and misery, and it's a long way back, an expensive way back.
Just a quick point then on the first question that Stan raised, which is that I think that global imbalances do matter, that when there are large persistent global imbalances, it does have not just an economic consequence, but also it erodes the support for an open trading system. But I think the way to address them is not to attempt to reach bilateral balance country by country, or worse still, sort of assume that you're basically going to go into a model of closed borders and have your own production, because that's just bring the world's level of economic well-being down dramatically. You know, that's a recipe for all of us to go down the wrong track, but rather to address this in a multilateral context. And I think that's the only way. It's a combination of demand policies and also expenditure switching in some countries that's going to encourage that, particularly in the United States, as Stan said. But I don't think that the consequence of this ought to be to focus on a sort of narrow view of bilateral trade balance.
Okay, before we get some more questions in the room, I'm just going to go to a couple of questions that we got from our virtual audience. This one from the live stream from someone who identifies themselves as Avi. Some say a security-focused approach to development damages principles of solidarity and human rights. So how can you recognize a security component without overshadowing solidarity and human rights? And I think, Helen, that echoes something that you said earlier about the UNDP being the international actor that can go in areas, say, authoritarian countries, because you go in and you have the space to push on human rights. But if they're more interested in security, how do you square that circle? That's one question. And then Andy Marshall from the One Campaign asks, on this declining consensus around aid that Masood, you talked about, have we, and I'm assuming he means the development community there, made the case for the effectiveness of aid sufficiently? Do people believe it works? Very different, very important points there.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, aid has become a bit of an Aunt Sally in some media circles. So, the narrative will be about, what didn't work, what went wrong.
But it's not just in media circles. It's also in
yeah, but then that goes into public discourse. But I guess largely here we have an audience of the converted, but there are plenty of positive stories to tell about the catalytic effect of aid. And there's aid and aid, isn't there? There's catalytic effect for medium to long-term development. But then there's also the aid and increasing proportions of it that goes into saving life and limb. And so, cuts in aid which affect the ability, for example, to stop people dying of famine in the 21st century in the 4 countries that have been set out as facing imminent danger. I mean, it's a pretty heavy calculation, isn't it, to say that this doesn't matter? Of course it matters. How can, in the 21st century, you have it on your conscience that all the warning signs are there, that without more investment, people are going to die, and you do nothing? I mean, this is not right. So, one hopes that both because we can show that the longer-term investments in development have mattered, have made a difference, and because the short-term investments in relief are absolutely vital to keeping people alive, that there is a strong case to be made here. I'm not sure I entirely get the point about the security-focused aid, but what I would say is that with so much donor spending now being focused on the most fragile countries, inevitably that does skew spending. But I suppose there's a point about that. If donor countries weren't paying for the police in Afghanistan, would there be police? Would there be even a modicum of law and order? If donor countries weren't paying to support people to return to their homes in some kind of stability, as ISIL is pushed out of towns in Iraq, well, what's the alternative? To go back and live with no sewage, no water, no ability to start the local market again. So of course money is going to go into that end of trying to secure some stability. But I think for me, what has been a concern over these years since the global financial crisis has been to see less strategic funding which can be invested in the poor but stable, and the middle income but stable, but which may have roots of instability, as we saw, I think, with the series of Arab states uprising. How do we keep this longer term strategic focus on what will support countries to make it through and have fairer, better societies for all that don't tip over into outright conflict.
Rich, can I just make one point on the issue of fragile states and post-conflict? I think one of the reasons why there isn't the model country is because it's very hard to come up with stylized facts of how to get post-conflict working in a way that can be applied generally. In each situation, you have to go into the specifics and particularities. So it's sort of a little bit the Tolstoy analogy there. And I would also say that the other reason why it's harder to work in that context is because you are bringing together the development agencies, the humanitarian agencies, and the security agencies. Each group of agencies has their own culture, their own way of operating, and putting them in the same frame and being able to work in a way that you can draw on each one's strengths is still work in progress. And I know some countries have made progress, more progress than others in achieving that in the international system. We've been trying for a while, but I think going forward, given that fragile states and conflict situations are going to be with us for many years to come, and given that a lot of the development work is going to have to be done there, it's an urgent agenda item to try and see if you can make better progress in having an integrated approach on delivering support.
Okay, Masood, I want 30 seconds from you on this idea of the consensus around aid. Now, it's a topic that you and I have discussed, but just give us a quick answer on that, and then we'll get 2 more questions, I think.
The only thing I would say about the consensus around aid is that I don't feel that over the last decade we have done enough to lay out a positive narrative around aid. We have become very focused on demonstrating value for money and effectiveness in a narrow, small sense. And even the analytical work that we have been doing is increasingly about sort of, random control trials that show which approach works better in a micro sense. But if you step back and say, are we making a compelling positive narrative about why it makes, for the reasons that you set out and others, why it makes sense for us to continue with this, and how what we do delivers good outcomes for all of us, I find that something which is less easily accessible than it was earlier on.
Thank you. Let's get 2 more questions. This lady, and then that gentleman, and then, sorry, everybody else. That'll be it.
Hi, I'm Cheng Cheng. I'm a PhD student in public administration. As I'm graduating in May, so I would be most grateful to hear your view on how the impact of the rising global nationalism will affect job opportunities in global development, and what will be the rising fields or most needed areas to start up. Thank you very much.
Is that a question about your own job prospects after the PhD?
Hey, why not?
Okay, that gentleman there.
My name is Emri Kori. I am Bangladeshi American. I have simple question. We know everything, nothing comes out of nothing. Every event has cause and effect. You are administrator at UNDP since 2008.
9.
However, Bangladesh is successful in raising higher growth and poverty elevation over a decade. Why you are telling this miracle? The success of Bangladesh in raising her economic growth rate and reducing poverty level, it has causes. Why UNDP and World Bank repeatedly telling it is miracle?
Okay, so the question there was Bangladesh's high growth rate and poverty eradication has been described, the gentleman was saying, by UNDP and World Bank as a miracle.
Don't think so. I don't think we ever described it as a miracle. But I mean, Bangladesh has been doing very well on growth and poverty eradication, and to the extent where lower middle income country status is close to being within grasp. So this is very, very, very significant. And I don't pretend to be the expert on the Bangladeshi economy, but maybe Masood has more observations to make. But certainly, we do see rising human development in Bangladesh for a wide range of reasons.
The other question was about rising nationalism, the effect on jobs, not just for PhD students, but generally for everybody.
Who knows? I mean, it relates back, I think, to the answer I gave in the last set of questions that, in the end, we're going to be trading. In the end, people are going to be buying and selling. And I think the attitude of countries who perhaps find more barriers than they did before will be to have the flexibility to look for new markets and how to generate more domestic demand, which won't be so easy for some who've had very export-oriented models, but argues for building well-diversified economies with a wide range of markets and the flexibility to change sectors and upskill people to be adaptable to changing circumstances, called resilience.
So do you want to make a point?
I'll just say, don't be discouraged. We have, if you look ahead, there are enormous things that need to be done in development. We've just been talking about fragile states. There's a lot of work to be done to try and understand better how to get better human outcomes in fragile conditions. You're talking about technology. There's a lot of work done already on technology, but linking that to how to improve development outcomes is a whole open area. So I can give you a list of 10 things where we need bright people to come in and work. And at CGD, we're always looking for bright people.
I think we just hired you. Okay, I think that's probably a fair, before he offers anyone else a job, I think that's probably a fair, a good point to finish. So, Helen, unless you come back in the next 3 or 4 weeks, this will be the last time you're here as the UNDP Administrator. You're very welcome to come back in the next 3 or 4 weeks, by the way. So thank you for your work in that role. And thank you once again for joining us today for this conversation. And thank you, Masood, and thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you. Thanks.